The mud behind Cobb's Tavern in the bitter winter of 1888 was not merely dirt and water. It was a living, freezing, malicious entity that sought to consume everything it touched. It smelled of spilled, cheap rye whiskey, rotting potato peels, and the metallic tang of freezing rain. The wind, howling down from the jagged, impenetrable teeth of the Bloodpine Ridge, bit through the threadbare layers of coarse wool like invisible, icy teeth, seeking the fragile, failing warmth of the flesh beneath. Maeve O'Connor's hands, cracked and bleeding at the knuckles, gripped the rough, splintering iron handle of the ash bucket. The bucket was impossibly heavy, filled with wet, freezing soot and half-burned hickory logs from the tavern's massive hearths. She was 23, and the heavy, layered, sodden wool dresses she wore made her appear substantial, masking the horrifying, hollow truth beneath. Maeve had always been a naturally soft woman, blessed with the generous, voluptuous curves of her Irish mother-wide hips, full breasts, and a rounded, gentle face. But after her father's death, when she had been taken in by Hiram Cobb to work off a fabricated debt, her natural size had become a cruel weapon used against her. Her stomach did not just rumble, it gnawed. It was a vicious, physical rat chewing at the lining of her ribs. Black spots danced aggressively at the edges of her vision, expanding and contracting with every agonizing beat of her exhausted heart. She swayed in the freezing mud, the slush seeping through the cracked leather of her worn boots, turning her toes into blocks of numb wood. She had not eaten a solid meal in 6 days. A crust of moldy bread and a cup of lukewarm, greasy dishwater was all she had been afforded. Because she did not look like a walking skeleton in her heavy clothes, Cobb declared she was thriving on the air itself. "Move your lazy, fat carcass, Maeve." Hiram Cobb stepped out onto the back porch of the tavern, a lit cigar clamped between his yellowed teeth, a half-empty bottle of rye whiskey swinging in his meaty hand. He was a man built of pure, unadulterated greed and casual cruelty, his small eyes glittering with malice. Behind him, a group of off-shift silver miners crowded the doorway, their faces smeared with coal dust, reeking of sweat, and eagerly watching the evening's entertainment. "Look at her, boys," Cobb sneered, taking a deep drag of his cigar and blowing the acrid smoke into the freezing rain. "Eats me out of house and home, she does. Look at the size of that sow. She's got enough fat on those hips to survive a 10-year winter, yet she complains about a missed supper. She's stealing from my larder, I know it." Maeve tried to take a desperate step forward toward the ash heap, but her knees, trembling violently from severe caloric deficit and absolute exhaustion, finally gave out. She collapsed into the freezing, churning mud, the heavy iron bucket tipping over and spilling wet, grey ash across her soaked skirt. A small, involuntary whimper escaped her cracked blue lips. The world tilted violently on its axis as a wave of severe dizziness washed over her. Cobb didn't hesitate. He stepped off the porch, his heavy, brass-tipped boot swinging forward. He kicked her hard in the thigh. Maeve gasped, curling into a tight, shivering ball in the muck, wrapping her arms protectively around her empty, aching stomach. "I ain't wasting another scrap of good pork on a fat, lazy cow who can't even haul ash," Cobb spat, turning back to the laughing miners. "Tell you what, boys, the winter's cold, and she's got a lot of surface area to keep her bed warm. I'll sell her contract right now. 1 full unopened bottle of rye and you can drag her back to the camps. Do whatever you want with her." The miners erupted into lewd, echoing cheers, 2 of them stepping off the porch, their filthy, calloused hands reaching out into the freezing mud to claim their prize. If you are liking this story, please subscribe. I know you must have subscribed by now, so let's continue. The hands never reached her. The drunken laughter of the miners was abruptly, violently severed by a sound that shook the very earth beneath their boots. It was the heavy, rhythmic, bone-jarring thud squelch of massive hooves breaking through the frozen crust of the tavern yard. The wind seemed to hold its breath. The silence that fell over the men was absolute, dripping with sudden, primal terror. A shadow rode into the freezing rain. He sat atop a massive, dark roan draft horse that looked more like a prehistoric beast of war than a riding animal. The man was a towering monument of isolation and lethal capability. He was wrapped entirely in a massive, thick mantle of stitched timberwolf pelts, the silver and grey fur frosted heavily with mountain rime. beneath the brim of his dark, low-pulled hat, his face was a rugged landscape of hardened lines, a thick, dark beard, and pale, slate-grey eyes that possessed the terrifying, unblinking stillness of an apex predator measuring its prey. Silas Ridge, the wolf of Blood Pine Ridge. He was a ghost story the valley folk told to keep drunks in line, a feral giant who lived higher than the tree line and traded only in the absolute best pelts. It was whispered he was a cannibal, a man who had forgotten how to speak the human tongue, a creature who survived the deep winters by embracing the ice and hunting the very wolves whose skins he wore. Silas pulled the massive roan horse to a halt. His pale eyes swept the yard, taking in the spilled ash, the jeering miners frozen in terror, the cruel tavern owner, and the violently shivering, mud-soaked woman curled in a defensive ball on the ground. Silas didn't speak. He didn't acknowledge Cobb's suddenly pale, sweating face. He swung his massive leg over the saddle and dropped to the earth. The mud shuddered under his immense, heavy weight. He walked toward Cobb, his iron-shod boots ignoring the slippery slush. Cobb instinctively took a terrified step backward, dropping his cigar into a puddle. Silas reached into the heavy leather belt at his waist. He pulled free a thick canvas pouch. He didn't toss it. He opened his massive leather-clad hand and let the contents drop directly into the freezing mud at Cobb's boots. 4 heavy, solid bars of pure, stamped mountain silver hit the muck with a dull, incredibly heavy thud. It was a staggering fortune, enough to buy the entire tavern, the land beneath it, and burn it all to the ground just for the warmth. Silas turned his broad back on the stunned, greedy men. He walked to where Maeve lay in the slush. She squeezed her eyes shut, her vision tunneling into darkness, preparing for the monster to drag her by the hair, waiting for the heavy hand of the beast to strike her. She was too weak to fight. She was ready to die in the mud. Instead, she heard the heavy metallic clack of a buckle. Silas shrugged off the massive, incredibly heavy wolf fur mantle. The freezing rain instantly bit at his canvas shirt, revealing the sheer, terrifying breadth of his chest and shoulders, but he ignored the cold entirely. He knelt in the freezing mud. With a shocking, breathless gentleness, the giant draped the enormous fur over Maeve's violently shivering body. The sheer weight of the pelt nearly flattened her, but the heat radiating from it, warm from his own massive body, was instantaneous and overwhelmingly intense. It smelled of pine sap, deep wood smoke, and a raw, untamed earthiness. Before she could process the warmth, Silas reached forward. His hands, the size of dinner plates, spanned her waist and the crook of her knees. He lifted her from the freezing slush with an effortless, terrifying ease, as if her heavy, wet dresses and soft frame weighed no more than a bundle of dry lavender. Maeve gasped, her eyes flying open, finding herself suspended high in the air, pressed flush against the rock-hard wall of his broad chest. Silas carried her to the massive roan horse, setting her sideways into the deep leather saddle with extreme care, ensuring the fur completely covered her freezing legs. He swung up behind her, his massive frame enveloping her completely, acting as an impenetrable wall of heat against the freezing wind. He took the reins in one hand, wrapping his other thick arms securely around her waist to keep her steady. He spurred the horse, turning its massive head toward the jagged, impassable crags of the mountain. Maeve clutched the heavy wolf fur around her throat, the black spots dancing aggressively in her starving vision, entirely convinced the monster had just purchased her to slaughter her in the high peaks where no one would ever hear her scream. The scream, however, remained trapped solidly behind her, violently chattering teeth as the massive roan draft horse began its punishing, vertical ascent into the impenetrable blackness of the Blood Pine Ridge. The freezing rain of the valley quickly hardened into a driving horizontal sleet that struck her exposed cheeks like handfuls of shattered glass. But Maeve could barely feel it. The cold was entirely secondary to the hollow, agonizing void inside her. Her stomach was a clenched, burning fist of pure acid. The severe caloric deficit had stripped the heat from her blood weeks ago, leaving her body to frantically consume its own reserves just to keep her lungs expanding. She slumped backward against the sheer, dense muscle of the giant's chest, completely unable to support her own weight in the heavy leather saddle. Silas Ridge did not speak. He did not issue commands to the massive beast beneath them. He guided the horse with subtle, imperceptible shifts of his iron-thick thighs, his massive arm remaining locked securely around Maeve's waist. He was a silent, terrifying furnace of raw heat, his broad shoulders acting as an impenetrable windbreak against the gale. But to Maeve, whose mind was fractured by starvation and the cruelty of Cobb's Tavern, his silence was simply the cold calculation of a butcher bringing a newly purchased animal to the block. Hours bled into a grey, freezing eternity. The air grew perilously thin, carrying the sharp, metallic scent of ozone and crushed pine needles. Just as the black spots in Maeve's vision threatened to swallow her consciousness entirely, the draft horse crested a jagged, treacherous switchback and let out a heavy, vibrating snort of exhausted steam. "Whoa!" Silas rumbled. The vibration of his voice, impossibly deep and resonant in his chest, startled her so badly she gasped, the cold air burning her raw throat. Emerging from the blinding squall of sleet was a fortress. The cabin was constructed of massive, unpeeled black pine logs, chinked tightly with hardened clay and crushed river stone. It was built directly against the sheer face of a towering granite cliff, squatting low to the earth to allow the brutal winter winds to roll over its heavy sod roof. There were no welcoming plumes of smoke from the fieldstone chimney, no warm golden light spilling from the narrow, heavy-shuttered windows. It was a dark, brooding monument to absolute, unyielding isolation. Silas swung his right leg over the saddle and dropped to the frozen, snow-packed earth. The ground shuddered under the impact of his heavy iron-shod boots. He did not ask if she was well. He did not offer a gentle guiding hand. He simply reached up, his massive leather-clad hands completely spanning her waist, and lifted her from the horse. The moment her soaked, ruined boots touched the uneven ground, her starved legs gave out entirely. Maeve gasped, her knees buckling instantly as the heavy, sodden layers of her wool dresses pulled her downward. She squeezed her eyes shut, bracing to hit the frozen dirt, waiting instinctively for the harsh bark of laughter and the sharp, punishing kick of a brass-tipped boot. It didn't come. Silas caught her. He didn't snatch her up roughly. His grip was shockingly steady, holding her upright by her upper arms until she could balance her wavering weight. He looked down at her. In the fading, bruised purple light of the mountain twilight, his face was a harsh, shadowed landscape beneath the brim of his hat. His pale, slate-gray eyes drifted downward, taking in the heavy, bulky silhouette of her layered, mud-soaked dresses. Maeve possessed the naturally full, voluptuous curves of her heritage-wide hips and a soft, generous frame. But under the heavy gaze of the mountain man, she felt an overwhelming, crushing wave of humiliation. She remembered Cobb's cruel, echoing words in the tavern yard. Fat, lazy cow. Too much surface area. A sow. Silas's jaw tightened. He jerked his head away, deliberately averting his gaze, looking at the heavy timber of the cabin door instead of her. To Maeve, the meaning was devastatingly clear. He cannot stand to look at me, she thought, the familiar, suffocating shame spiraling in her gut, mixing with the nausea of starvation. He paid a fortune in silver for me, and now he is utterly repulsed by the size of the creature he bought. "Inside," Silas commanded, his voice a flat, gravelly scrape that offered no warmth. He released her arms as quickly as if the wet wool of her sleeves had burned him. He turned his broad back to her, unstrapping his heavy sharps rifle and the canvas sack from the saddle. Maeve swallowed the thick knot of terror in her throat, clutched the heavy wolf fur tightly around her neck, and stumbled on numb, unfeeling feet toward the heavy oak door. She pushed it open, stepping into the freezing gloom. The cabin smelled of trapped time, old wood ash, curing leather, and a profound, suffocating loneliness. As Silas entered behind her, scraping a lucifer match against the door frame to light a kerosene lantern hanging from a ceiling joist, the yellow light chased the shadows into the corners, revealing the stark reality of the beast's den. The space was a single, cavernous room. A heavy wooden table, scarred by skinning knives and burns, dominated the center. Steel-jawed traps of terrifying sizes hung from the heavy rafters. In the far corner sat a large bed frame built from thick birch branches piled 2 feet deep with the incredibly thick, luxurious skins of wolves and buffalo. Silas dropped his sack onto the table. He walked to the massive bed, grabbed a single thin wool blanket from beneath the heavy furs, and threw it onto the hard, packed earth floor near the drafty front door. "The bed is yours," he stated, his voice completely devoid of inflection. He still refused to look at her. Maeve stared at him, bewildered, her hands gripping the filthy, wet fabric of her skirt. "But it's your home, sir." I am. I am the worker. You paid my debt. I am accustomed to the floor. I should. The bed is yours, Silas repeated, the tone lowering into a dangerous, absolute register that left no room for argument. He turned his back, facing the massive, cold cast-iron stove, grabbing a piece of kindling. I sleep by the door. Don't touch the rifles. Don't go outside. The wind will freeze the blood in your veins before you take 10 steps. Why did you buy me? Maeve whispered, the word escaping her cracked, blue lips before she could stop it. Her voice trembled with a mixture of sheer terror and overwhelming exhaustion. Mr. Cobb said I was useless. I know I am large, sir, but I swear I can work. I can haul the ash. Please don't hurt me. Silas stopped. His massive shoulders tensed under his canvas shirt. He slowly turned his head, his profile illuminated by the newly struck match in his hand. He didn't look at her soft, shivering frame. He looked at the floorboards between them. I bought a worker, Silas grunted, a lie so heavy it seemed to sink directly into the dirt floor. I need someone to keep the stove hot while unchecking the trap lines. That's all. He stood up, grabbing a heavy coil of rope and a hatchet from the log wall. I have the draft horse to bed down and a cord of wood to split before the blizzard peaks, he said, walking toward the door, keeping a wide berth around her. There's dried meat and beans in the cellar. Don't wait up. The heavy oak door slammed shut, the iron latch falling with a terrifying metallic finality. Maeve was left alone in the echoing, freezing silence of the mountain. She stood there for a long time, the cold seeping through the thin soles of her ruined boots. The rejection stung worse than the freezing wind. He had paid a king's ransom in pure silver, yet he treated her like a stray, diseased animal he had taken in out of begrudging obligation, too disgusted to share a space with her, too repulsed to even look her in the eye. If I do not work, he will not feed me, Maeve thought, the brutal, ingrained trauma of Cobb's tavern seizing her mind. Cobb had withheld her meager scraps of mouldy bread whenever she failed to haul the heaviest loads, claiming a fat sow didn't need rations. She looked at the massive, cold, cast-iron stove. If she didn't prove her worth, the giant would let her starve in the dark. She forced herself to move. Her muscles screamed in violent protest, her joints aching with the deep, gnawing pain of severe malnutrition. She dragged her heavy, sodden wool skirts across the swept dirt floor. The cabin was built for a beast, not a woman. The massive stove was choked with 2 feet of cold grey ash. The floor around the hearth was scattered with heavy, unsplit logs of dense hickory and black pine. Maeve found a heavy iron ash shovel resting against the stone chimney. She gripped the cold metal handle, her bruised, cracked fingers trembling. She knelt before the stove. The simple act of bending her knees sent a rush of blackness across her vision, the blood draining rapidly from her head. She squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for the dizziness to pass, her breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. I must earn my keep, she repeated to herself like a desperate prayer. I must show him I am not lazy. She shoved the heavy iron spade into the compacted ash. She tried to lift it. The shovel barely moved. To a healthy woman, the weight of the ash would have been trivial. To Maeve, whose body had entirely consumed its own muscle tissue to keep her heart beating over the last 6 days, it felt like an anchor forged of solid lead. She gritted her teeth, ignoring the agonizing, burning hollow in her stomach, and threw her entire upper body weight onto the handle. She managed to lift a single shovelful of ash, dumping it clumsily into a waiting tin bucket. Sweat, cold and clammy, broke out across her pale forehead despite the freezing temperature of the cabin. She went back for a second scoop. This time, the iron edge of the shovel caught on the heavy cast-iron grate inside the stove. Maeve shoved hard to free it. The sudden jarring resistance was the final fatal draw on a completely bankrupt reservoir of energy. A high-pitched, metallic ringing pierced her ears, drowning out the howl of the wind battering the thick pine logs outside. The dim, yellow light of the kerosene lantern fractured into 1,000 blinding, aggressively dancing black spots. The violent, gnawing rat in her stomach seemed to twist, entirely paralyzing her diaphragm. "No!" Maeve whispered, a tiny broken sound in the empty room. "Please, no." The heavy iron shovel slipped from her numb, bloodless fingers, clattering loudly against the stone hearth. The world tilted violently on a sickening axis. Maeve's knees simply ceased to function. She collapsed forward, her heavy, mud-soaked wool dresses pooling around her as she hit the hard, packed earth floorboards. The darkness that had been threatening her for a week finally rushed in, absolute and consuming, swallowing her whole. Outside, the wind had escalated into a demonic, high-altitude shriek, driving the sleet sideways with the force of thrown gravel. Silas Ridge kicked the heavy oak door open, a massive bundle of freshly split, sap-heavy pine resting effortlessly on his broad shoulder. He was a snowman built around a core of solid granite, ice clinging to his dark, wild beard and thick icicles. He stepped into the cabin, leaning his massive weight against the door to drop the heavy iron bar into place, sealing out the lethal cold. He expected the dark. He expected the freezing, empty silence of a cabin that had not felt the touch of a woman in years. He expected a terrified, weeping girl huddled in the corner of his bed, paralyzed by her own fear and the sheer, overwhelming size of the man who had bought her. He did not expect the absolute stillness on the floorboards. Silas stopped dead, his massive chest heaving, the bundle of heavy firewood slipping entirely from his grasp. The heavy logs hit the dirt floor with a thunderous clatter, but Silas didn't flinch. Lying perfectly still before the cold, unlit cast-iron stove was Maeve. "Maeve!" Silas roared, his voice completely devoid of the gruff, terrifying distance he had maintained. The wolf of blood Pine Ridge vanished, replaced entirely by a man gripped by sudden, visceral panic. He crossed the room in two massive strides, his iron-shod boots sliding slightly on the dirt. He dropped heavily to his knees beside her unmoving form. She was deathly pale, her lips carrying a terrifying tinge of blue, her skin cold to the touch. The heavy iron ash shovel lay discarded near her limp, bruised hand. She had tried to work. She had tried to clean the ash in a freezing cabin rather than rest. "Damn it, woman," Silas swore, his voice shaking. "I told you to rest." He reached down to lift her from the freezing floorboards. His massive hands, scarred from skinning bears and hauling timber, slid beneath her back and the crook of her knees to scoop her up. He expected the heavy, substantial weight of the voluptuous, full-figured woman he had seen in the tavern yard. He braced his massive shoulders to lift her. As he pulled her upward, the heavy, mud-soaked layers of her coarse wool dresses shifted and fell back against his forearms. Silas froze. The breath rushed from his massive lungs in a stunned, horrified exhale. Beneath the thick, deceptive bulk of the multiple tavern skirts and heavy wool bodice, there was nothing. His large, calloused hand, resting against her ribcage, felt the sharp, protruding ridges of bone pressing directly against the thin fabric of her camise. As he lifted her, her head lolled back against his thick bicep, exposing the stark, hollowed-out cavities of her collarbones. She possessed the natural, wide skeletal frame of a full-figured woman, but there was absolutely zero flesh left upon it. She was entirely weightless. Silas stared down at the woman in his arms. The truth hit him with the concussive force of a physical blow to the jaw. Hiram Cobb had not just insulted her size. He had not just worked her in the mud. He had used her natural, soft frame as an excuse to systematically, deliberately starve her to the absolute brink of death. She wasn't just cold and tired. Her body was actively, desperately consuming itself. A dark, terrifying, unholy wrath flared behind Silas's pale slate eyes. He looked down at the bruised, bloodless, beautiful face resting against his chest, feeling the weak, thready, erratic flutter of her heart struggling to beat. "You didn't eat," Silas whispered into the freezing air of the cabin, his voice trembling with an overwhelming, consuming horror. He clutched her frail, wasting body tighter against his massive chest. "God forgive me, you're starving." He didn't waste another fraction of a second. Silas carried her entirely limp, terrifyingly light frame to the massive bed in the corner. He laid her gently upon the thick, luxurious buffalo robes, pulling a heavy wolfskin blanket up to her chin to trap whatever meager, failing heat her body was still managing to produce. He had to get the cast-iron stove roaring immediately, that the massive roan draft horse was still tied outside, exposed to a blizzard that was rapidly escalating from a severe squall into a lethal, blinding whiteout. Silas turned his back on the bed, his jaw clenched so tightly the muscles jumped beneath his dark beard. He grabbed his heavy hatchet, throwing the heavy oak door open to the shrieking night. The wind hit him like a physical, suffocating wall of crushed ice. He forced his way through the knee-deep drifts toward the lean-to barn attached to the side of the cabin. The cold was absolute, blinding him as he grabbed the draft horse's halter, wrestling the panicked massive beast into the sheltered stall. He threw a heavy wool blanket over the horse's shivering flanks and turned to rush back to the cabin. He didn't see the ice until it gave way. The thermal spring that ran deep beneath the mountain occasionally surfaced in hidden, treacherous pockets near the cliff face. Covered by the freshly drifted snow, the thin crust of ice snapped under the sheer, driving weight of his iron-shod boot. Silas plunged waist-deep into the freezing subterranean meltwater. The shock was paralyzing. The water was so incredibly cold it felt like a searing, white-hot ring of fire clamping entirely around his chest, instantly driving the oxygen from his lungs. He roared in shock, his massive arms thrashing against the jagged edges of the ice, hauling his 250-pound frame out of the sinkhole through pure, adrenaline-fueled brute strength. He collapsed onto the snowbank, gasping for the thin, slicing air. The wind immediately attacked his soaked canvas trousers and heavy boots, flash freezing the water to his skin in seconds. His core temperature plummeted with terrifying, lethal speed. Hypothermia did not creep into his bones, it struck him down like a felled timber. He dragged himself the remaining 20 yards to the cabin door. He pushed the heavy oak inward, stumbling blindly across the threshold. He didn't have the strength to reach the hearth. The giant crashed heavily onto the packed earth floorboards, the heavy doors slamming shut behind him, sealing them in the dark. The violent, concussive thud vibrated through the floorboards and up into the bed frame. May's eyes fluttered open. Her head swam in a sickening dark vortex of starvation and dizzy exhaustion, but the sound of the crash pierced through the fog. She turned her head weakly. Lying in the center of the dark cabin, shivering so violently his massive shoulders were convulsing against the dirt, was Silas. His clothes were encased in a rigid, gleaming shell of solid black ice. Maeve tried to sit up. The room spun wildly, her empty stomach violently cramping in protest. She had nothing left. She was a hollowed-out shell of a woman, starved to the absolute brink of death. But as she looked at the giant, the only creature who had lifted her out of the freezing mud, instead of kicking her deeper into it, a fierce, primal surge of protective empathy ignited in her chest. She rolled off the heavy furs, hitting the dirt floor on her hands and knees. She couldn't walk. She dragged herself across the sweeping floorboards, her numb fingers gripping the rough wood, inching her way toward his violently shaking form. "Mr. Ridge!" she croaked, her throat as dry as parchment. She reached his side. His lips were a terrifying bloodless blue, his pale slate eyes rolled back in his head. The freezing wet clothes were killing him. Maeve fought the frozen fabric. Her cracked, bleeding fingers clumsily worked the stiff leather laces of his heavy boots, finally yanking them free. She peeled the freezing wet canvas shirt away from his massive, heavily muscled chest, her own breath coming in ragged, desperate gasps. She was far too weak to move him to the bed. She turned, dragging the heaviest buffalo robes and wolf pelts down from the mattress, pulling them across the dirt floor to cover him entirely. But it wasn't enough. The deep core freeze had taken hold of his blood. The air in the unheated cabin was dropping rapidly toward zero. Maeve didn't hesitate. Her trembling, bruised fingers unbuttoned the sodden, filthy layers of her coarse tavern dresses. They pooled in a heavy heap on the dirt. She stripped down to her thin, threadbare cotton camise. She lifted the edge of the heavy furs and crawled underneath them, pressing her soft, fragile, starving body directly against the giant's massive, freezing frame. The shock of his icy skin against hers made her gasp, a full-body shudder racking her frame, but she forced herself to wrap her thin, frail arms around his broad chest. She pressed her softly beating heart against his rigid, shivering ribcage. She tangled her legs with his thick thighs, burying her face into the crook of his icy neck. "Take the warmth," she whispered fiercely, willing the absolute last reserves of her failing life into him. "Do not die in the dark. Please do not die." For an hour he shivered violently, his massive body convulsing against hers. Maeve held on tight, an anchor in the freezing blackness. Slowly, agonizingly, the shivering began to subside as his massive heart fought off the hypothermia. Then the fever fully took his mind. As his body fought the trauma of the ice water, he thrashed weakly beneath the furs, his mind slipping into the dark, agonizing corridors of his past. "Eliza," Silas mumbled, his voice a broken, raspy scrape that tore at Maeve's heart. "Eliza, don't sleep. You have to stay awake." Maeve held him tighter, her hand gently stroking his sweat-dampened dark hair. "Hush now. You're warm. The storm can't reach you." He didn't hear her. His large, calloused hand came up, grasping blindly in the dark beneath the furs until his thick fingers locked onto her frail shoulder. "I couldn't find the elk," Silas wept, a single hot tear tracking down his rugged, weather-beaten face. It was a sound of absolute, devastating heartbreak that shattered the image of the invincible wolf entirely. The snow was too deep. 6 weeks. The larder was empty. I watched you waste away. I watched you starve in my own bed, and I couldn't save you. Maeve froze, the breath leaving her lungs in a quiet, devastated rush. The feral isolation, the heavy pelts, the terrifying, unyielding nature of the mountain man wasn't because he hated the world. It was because his wife had starved to death in his arms during a brutal winter, and the guilt had driven him into the impassable crags. He hated the cold because it had stolen the woman he loved. And when he had lifted May from the mud, expecting a substantial, healthy woman, only to feel the sharp, wasting bones of a starving girl beneath her clothes, he had come face to face with his deepest, most agonizing nightmare all over again. "Oh, Silas," Maeve whispered, hot tears spilling down her cheeks, falling onto his fever-hot chest. She pressed her face against his jaw, holding him with a fierce, protective tenderness. "I am here. I am not gone." His thrashing ceased. The frantic, rolling motion of his eyes beneath his closed eyelids slowed. The heavy, suffocating grip of his guilt seemed to loosen just a fraction at the feel of her tears on his skin. He sank into a deep, healing, dreamless sleep. The exertion, combined with the extreme starvation, finally claimed Maeve. She slipped out of consciousness, her head resting heavy against his massive chest. By the time the grey, watery light of dawn filtered through the frosted window slits, the blizzard had broken into a quiet, spent sigh against the logs. Silas opened his eyes. The delirium was gone. He felt the heavy, suffocating weight of the furs, the dull, deep ache in his muscles, and the astonishing, overwhelming heat pressed along the entire length of his body. He turned his head slowly. Maeve was asleep, her face inches from his own. Her dark hair was splayed across his massive shoulder. Her thin arm was thrown over his torso, but the heavy, deceptive tabard dresses were gone. She wore only the thin, white cotton chemise. Silas barely breathed. He looked at the woman pressed against him. He could see the stark, hollowed-out shadows beneath her cheekbones, the incredibly sharp, protruding line of her collarbone. She had the wide, generous hips and soft structure of a woman meant to be beautifully full-figured, but the flesh had been cruelly, systematically starved away, leaving a fragile, wasting silhouette. She had dragged herself across the freezing floorboards. She had stripped her own clothes off and used her final, fading heartbeat to keep him from freezing to death. Silas shifted his weight, moving with agonizing care so as not to wake her. He slipped out from beneath the furs, immediately pulling the heavy robes up to tuck them securely around her chin. He stood up in the freezing cabin. The feral giant was gone. In his place was a man possessed by a singular, holy, consuming purpose. He walked to the hearth. He moved with a quiet, deliberate grace, building a massive, roaring fire in the cast-iron stove until the heavy black metal literally hummed with intense, radiating heat. He did not reach for the dried beans or the tough, salted pork. A starving stomach, shrunk to the size of a fist by weeks of deprivation, would violently reject solid food. It required a gentle, incredibly rich, life-giving fat to line the organ and awaken the digestive fire. Silas went to the root cellar. He hauled up a massive, frozen femur bone from a recently harvested elk, rich with thick, dark marrow. He used his heavy felling axe to expertly crack the bone down the center, exposing the incredibly dense, nutrient-rich core. He placed the cracked bones into a heavy iron kettle, covering them with fresh, clean snowmelt from the spring basin. For 3 hours, Silas stood vigil over the stove. He didn't blink. He didn't rest his own aching muscles. He slow-roasted a small, tender cut of venison backstrap over the open flames, collecting the rich, dripping fat, and slowly stirred it into the boiling kettle. He added a pinch of wild mountain salt and dried wild onions. The cabin slowly filled with the most incredible, heavy, mouth-watering aroma of roasting meat and rich, bubbling marrow broth. When the broth was thick, viscous, and gleaming with a beautiful layer of life-giving fat, Silas removed it from the heat. He poured the liquid into a beautifully carved wooden bowl, letting it cool just enough so it wouldn't burn. He walked back to the bed. He knelt on the dirt floor beside the furs. He reached out with his massive, scarred left hand, gently brushing a stray lock of dark hair away from Maeve's pale, sweat-dampened forehead. "Maeve," Silas whispered, his voice incredibly deep, rough, but softer than the falling snow. "Wake up, little bird. It's time." Maeve groaned, a weak, fluttering sound. Her eyes slowly blinked open. The black spots immediately rushed her vision, but then the aroma hit her. Her eyes widened, her pupils dilating as the rich, fatty smell of the roasted marrow broth reached her starving senses. Her stomach violently contracted, an involuntary, desperate response. She tried to push herself up on her elbows, her eyes locking wildly onto the wooden bowl in his hands, but her arms simply gave way. She collapsed back against the furs, a small, humiliated sob escaping her lips. "I can't," she wept, the absolute despair of her weakness breaking her. "I can't sit up." "Hush," Silas rumbled gently. He set the bowl carefully on the floorboards. He slid his massive right arm beneath her back and shoulders, lifting her with effortless, reverent care. He propped her up against the thick headboard, adjusting the fur so she was completely enveloped in warmth, her head resting securely against his massive bicep. He picked up the bowl. He took a beautifully carved wooden spoon from his pocket. He didn't hand the bowl to her trembling fingers. He filled the spoon with the thick, rich, steaming broth. He brought it to his own lips, blowing on it gently to ensure the temperature was perfect. Then he brought the wooden spoon to her cracked blue lips. Maeve stared at him, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her sharp ribs. The monster of the mountain, the giant she thought had brought her to work her to death, was looking down at her, not with the disgust of the tavern owner, but with an absolute, unshakable religious devotion. She opened her mouth. Silas tipped the spoon. The rich, salty, incredibly fatty marrow broth washed over her tongue. It was shockingly flavorful, a burst of pure, concentrated life that coated her raw throat and settled into her burning, empty stomach like a warm, soothing balm. It was the most beautiful, profound thing she had ever tasted. A hot tear spilled over her eyelashes, tracking down her hollow cheek. She swallowed, letting out a soft, involuntary sigh of pure bliss. "Slowly," Silas whispered, his pale slate eyes locked onto hers, watching the color begin to faintly bloom in her pale cheeks. He filled the spoon again, bringing it back to her lips. "I have the whole elk. I have a cellar full of roots. You will eat every drop. You will take every bite." He fed her by hand, spoonful by agonizingly slow, perfect spoonful. He didn't rush her. He didn't speak. He simply sat on the edge of the bed, a feral giant completely tamed by the fragility of the woman in his arms, meticulously returning the life to her starving bones. When the bowl was finally empty, Maeve leaned her head back against his massive arm, her breathing deep and even, the sharp, agonizing gnaw in her stomach finally silenced. She looked up into his rugged, deeply scarred face. "You are not a monster, Mr. Ridge," Maeve whispered, her voice incredibly soft, heavy with the incoming tide of a deeply healing sleep. Silas looked down at her soft, resting face. He gently pulled the furs up to her chin, his large hand resting protectively over her heart. "The name is Silas," he rumbled, the heavy, agonizing guilt of his past finally beginning to thaw in the profound warmth of the cabin. "And you will never be hungry again. Which country are you watching this video from? Please let me know in the comments below. The promise held true through the darkest, most brutal months of the winter. Silas did not simply feed her. He orchestrated a meticulous, reverent resurrection of her flesh. For the first 2 weeks, it was only the rich, golden marrow broth, fed to her spoonful by agonizingly slow spoonful until her violently shrunken stomach could safely accept the weight of it. Then came the soft, slow-roasted venison backstrap, mashed mountain root vegetables, heavily glazed in rendered fat, and thick, savory stews that filled the heavy pine logs of the cabin with the constant, intoxicating scent of life. Slowly, the terrifying skeletal hollows of Maeve's cheeks filled in, blooming with a healthy, radiant, rosy flush. The sharp, protruding edges of her collarbones and ribs softened, covered once again by the natural, generous, voluptuous curves she had been born with. The heavy, sodden wool tavern dresses were discarded entirely, replaced by oversized, soft flannel shirts. Silas meticulously altered with a bone needle to fit her full figure. She was a woman inherently meant to take up space, meant to be soft and substantial, and Silas worshipped that softness with an awe that bordered on the holy. In the quiet hours of the night, lit only by the glowing embers of the cast-iron stove, his massive, calloused hands would gently rest on the full, restored curve of her hip. He didn't look at her with the crude lust of the tavern miners. He looked at her as absolute, undeniable proof that he had finally beaten the cold. To Hiram Cobb, her size had been a sin to be starved away in the mud. To the wolf of Blood Pine Ridge, her soft, heavy warmth was a kingdom he would burn the world to protect. As the brutal high-country winter finally exhausted its fury, the grip of the ice upon the mountain began to loosen. The spring thaw did not arrive with a gentle, whispering breeze. It announced itself with a violent, concussive cracking of deep ice giving way. Rushing cataracts of black meltwater and viscous slush tore through the jagged ravines, carrying boulders the size of anvils in their frothing, icy jaws. Inside the sanctuary of the cabin, Maeve stood before the roaring cast-iron stove. She was humming softly, her hips swaying as she used a heavy wooden spoon to stir a bubbling pot of chicory coffee and mountain honey. Silas sat at the heavy oak table, running a whetstone along the edge of his massive felling axe. The rhythmic shh of the steel was a soothing, deeply domestic sound. Crack. The sound was sharp, flat, and entirely unnatural to the high peaks. Before Maeve could even turn her head, a heavy lead slug shattered the thick wooden shutter of the front window, tearing through the cabin in a shower of jagged, lethal splinters. The bullet slammed directly into the heavy iron coffee pot on the stove, exploding the metal and sending boiling, pitch-black liquid hissing violently across the scorching iron plates. Silas moved before the deafening echo of the gunshot had even faded from the granite cliffs. The whetstone dropped to the table. He lunged across the swept dirt floor, his massive frame moving with a terrifying, explosive speed, tackling Maeve to the floorboards just as a second bullet tore through the roof timbers above them. "Stay down!" Silas roared, his voice completely devoid of the gentle, rumbling warmth it held moments ago. The wolf of Blood Pine had returned, his slate-grey eyes wild, feral, and blazing with a holy, terrifying wrath. Outside, the slushy mud of the yard was being violently churned by the hooves of several horses. "Ridge." The voice that floated over the rushing wind made Maeve's stomach violently heave, the taste of honey turning to pure bile in her mouth. It was Hiram Cobb. It was the voice of the freezing mud, of the ash bucket, of the cruel, calculated starvation that had nearly ended her life. "Come out, you feral savage!" Cobb screamed, his voice thick with an ugly, desperate greed, amplified by the safety of the tree line. "We know what you got in there!" "A beast don't pay for a fat tavern, sir, with freshly minted silver bars, unless he robbed a transport or he's sitting on a vault. Give us the silver, and we'll leave enough of you for the buzzards." Silas rolled off Maeve, keeping low to the floorboards. He scrambled to the center of the room, his thick fingers finding the recessed iron ring of the root cellar trapdoor. He yanked it upward, exposing the dark earthen hole. "Get in the dark," Silas commanded, his jaw clenched so tight the skin pulled taut across his bone. He shoved a heavy, loaded Colt revolver into her hands. "If the face looking down ain't mine, you empty the cylinder into it. Do you understand?" "Silas, there are too many," Maeve choked out, the suffocating, ingrained terror of her former master threatening to paralyze her throat. "They'll kill you." "They brought paper cartridges and cheap whiskey," Silas rumbled, turning his back to the door and pulling his massive Sharps buffalo rifle from the wall. "I am bringing the mountain." He didn't wait for her to descend. He kicked the heavy oak front door entirely open with his iron-shod boot and stepped out onto the porch, a towering, nightmarish silhouette against the bright morning glare. "We brought a posse's Ridge," Cobb yelled, his horse rearing nervously in the slush. 6 hired thugs from the valley, ruthless, dead-eyed miners looking for an easy share of the silver, Strike found out through the mud, raising their repeating rifles. Silas didn't speak. He didn't negotiate with vultures. He raised the heavy Sharps rifle to his broad shoulder. Boom. The roar of the black powder was utterly deafening. A blinding flash of muzzle fire illuminated the grey shadows of the pines. A hired gun, 30 yards away with his Winchester raised, took the brunt of the massive, heavy-grained slug directly in the center of his chest. The kinetic force punched him backward off his feet, launching him through the air as if kicked by a draft horse, landing dead in the freezing, bloody slush. "Fire! Kill the beast!" Cobb screamed in panic, spurring his horse backward behind a thick boulder. A ragged volley of rifle fire erupted from the trees. Bullets hammered the thick black pine logs of the cabin, tearing massive, deadly splinters from the wood. The heavy Sharps rifle took too long to reload. Silas dropped the smoking weapon onto the porch. He didn't retreat inside for cover. He reached over his shoulder, drawing the massive, heavy-headed iron felling axe, and vaulted over the heavy timber railing. He landed in the freezing, ankle-deep slush of the yard with a heavy, wet splash. He moved through the mud with a terrifying, unnatural speed. He met the first flanker before the man could work the lever of his rifle. Silas swung the heavy felling axe in a brutal, horizontal arc. The flat iron back of the axe head crushed the man's ribs with a sickening crunch, sending him crashing into the mud, screaming in absolute agony. Silas spun, using the momentum of the heavy axe to block a desperate bayonet thrust from a second man. He grabbed the hot barrel of the man's rifle with his bare left hand, ignoring the searing heat of the metal, and drove his massive, bearded forehead directly into the bridge of the man's nose. Cartilage shattered. Bright arterial blood sprayed across the white slush. The yard became a chaotic, swirling nightmare of acrid sulfur, copper blood, and raw, visceral violence. Silas was a force of nature, taking a grazing bullet to his thick thigh and a shallow slice across his bicep, but he didn't slow. He waded through the hired killers, roaring, breaking the men who had dared to bring violence to his sanctuary. But in his feral, blood-soaked rage, the giant had been drawn down the slope, 50 yards away from the cabin walls. Hiram Cobb had not joined the fight in the mud. He was a coward who fought only women and starving girls. While Silas decimated the posse, Cobb slipped off his horse, creeping around the jagged granite cliff face, moving toward the back of the cabin where a narrow window had been shattered by the crossfire. Inside the cabin, Maeve had not gone down into the root cellar. She heard the deafening cracks of gunfire outside, the metallic scent of black powder drifting through the open front door. Then she heard the loud, unmistakable crunch of heavy boots on broken glass. Not outside, inside. Maeve froze. She crouched behind the heavy oak table, the Colt revolver, heavy and shaking in her hands. A man smelling of stale rye whiskey, cheap tobacco, and unwashed sweat was climbing through the shattered rear window, his heavy coat catching on the jagged splinters of the frame. Cobb dropped heavily onto the dirt floor, his breathing ragged, a rusted hunting knife gripped tightly in his meaty hand. His small, cruel eyes darted wildly around the dim space, searching for the loose floorboard, searching for the silver hoard. He turned toward the hearth, and he stopped dead. Standing beside the cast-iron stove, her weight braced perfectly on her bare feet, was Maeve. She wasn't a shivering, fainting skeleton drowning in mud-soaked wool. She was wearing the oversized flannel shirt, the soft, generous curves of her restored, healthy body clearly defined in the firelight. Her dark hair was loose, falling over shoulders that were no longer sharp, protruding bones but smooth, strong flesh. "Well, well," Cobb breathed, profound shock warring with his malicious greed. An ugly, vicious sneer twisted his thin lips as he took in her radiant health. "Look at the fatso. The savage has been feeding you well, hasn't he? Fattening you up for the winter." He took a step toward her, raising the rusted hunting knife, a leering, malicious intent in his eyes. "Tell me where the silver is, Maeve," Cobb spat, lunging forward. "Tell me, and maybe I'll take you back to the tavern. Put you back in the ash where you belong." Maeve didn't cower. She didn't weep. She looked at the man who had starved her, who had kicked her when her heart was failing, who had offered her to drunken men for a bottle of cheap liquor. The suffocating, ingrained terror of her former life vanished entirely, replaced by a blinding, white-hot inferno of rage. She was not the empty, hollowed-out ghost of the valley. She had been fed by the hands of a giant. She had been worshipped back to life. Maeve didn't raise the heavy revolver. Her hands were shaking too badly with adrenaline to steady the heavy hammer. Instead, she dropped the gun to the dirt. Her right hand swept down to the top of the stove. her fingers wrapped around the thick, heavy cast-iron handle of the massive boiling kettle she used for stews. It was empty, but the iron itself weighed nearly 15 pounds. She swung. She brought the massive iron kettle out from her side in a brutal, desperate, two-handed R. She put every ounce of her newly restored, heavily fueled upper body strength and the full, substantial momentum of her turning hips into the blow. Crack! The heavy, solid iron bottom of the kettle slammed directly into the side of Hiram Cobb's jaw. The sound of the mandible shattering and unhinging was sickeningly loud, like a thick, dry branch exploding under the wheel of a heavy wagon. Teeth flew like shrapnel across the sweeping dirt floor. Cobb didn't even have the breath to scream. His eyes rolled entirely back in his head. The rusted hunting knife flew from his deadened grip, clattering uselessly against the stone hearth. His heavy body collapsed completely inward, crashing heavily to the dirt floor in a heap of cheap wool and broken bone, completely unconscious before he even hit the ground. Maeve stood over him, her full chest heaving, the breath hissing aggressively through her teeth. Her knuckles were stuck white around the handle of the kettle, the heavy iron still raised in a threatening stance. The soft, gentle girl of the tavern was gone. She looked wild. She looked terrifying. The heavy front door was suddenly filled with a massive, looming shadow. Silas burst back into the room. He was a terrifying vision of absolute carnage. His massive chest was heaving, his canvas shirt torn to ribbons and soaked in the blood of the posse outside. The heavy felling axe in his hand dripped thick crimson onto the pristine floorboards. His pale slate-grey eyes were wild with panic, expecting to find her bleeding on the floor. He looked at the shattered rear window, he looked at the broken, bleeding man unconscious in the dirt, and he looked at Maeve. She stood tall, her generous frame radiating power, the heavy iron weapon still raised in her hands, her beautiful face flushed with exertion, her eyes blazing with a fierce, untamed fire. She met his shocked gaze, her breathing ragged but entirely steady. Silas didn't speak. He stepped forward, grabbed the unconscious, bleeding tavern owner by the collar of his coat, and dragged him violently out the front door, hurling him off the edge of the porch to tumble down the rocky, slush-covered slope with the rest of his broken posse. The sickening crunch of Cobb's heavy body hitting the jagged, slush-covered rocks at the bottom of the ravine echoed faintly over the howling mountain wind. The surviving hired guns, the men who could still draw breath around shattered ribs and broken noses, were already scrambling blindly down the treacherous switchbacks, abandoning their horses, their weapons, and their cruel master to the absolute mercy of the Blood Pine Ridge. Silas stood on the edge of the wooden porch, a towering, blood-soaked monument against the blinding white glare of the morning snow. The feral, terrifying adrenaline that had fueled his wrath instantly evaporated, leaving a crushing, hollow exhaustion in its wake. The wind bit at his heavily muscled chest, exposed through the shredded ribbons of his canvas shirt. He turned slowly, his heavy, iron-shod boots dragging across the floorboards as he stepped back over the threshold into the sweltering heat of the cabin. Maeve stood in the center of the swept dirt floor. She dropped the heavy cast-iron kettle. It hit the hearthstones with a loud, ringing clang that vibrated in the sudden, ringing silence of the room. She didn't hesitate. She didn't shrink away from the gore coating his massive hands or the wild, untamed violence that still radiated in waves from his towering frame. She hurried to him, her bare feet silent on the floorboards, her soft, warm hands reaching out to press directly against his heaving, blood-stained chest. "You're bleeding," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly now that the immediate, terrifying threat was gone. Her eyes darted over the shallow bullet graze across his thick thigh and the deep, weeping slice on his massive bicep. "Silas, sit down, please." He allowed her to guide him to the heavy oak table. He sank onto the bench, the thick timber groaning beneath his immense, dead weight. Maeve fetched the wash basin, filling it from the heavy iron kettle that still steamed on the stove. She grabbed a clean, soft linen rag and a cake of harsh lye soap. She returned to his side, her hands moving with a practiced, desperate urgency. She washed the thick, drying blood and the black, acrid soot of the gunpowder from his skin. Silas hissed as the hot water hit the raw, open flesh of his arm, his massive hands gripping the edge of the table until his thick knuckles turned to stark, bone-white, but he didn't pull away. He didn't look at the wound. He looked at her. He looked at the dark, bruised circles of exhaustion that had momentarily returned beneath her eyes. He looked at the soft, generous curve of her hips beneath the oversized flannel shirt, the body he had spent months painstakingly, reverently pulling back from the brink of starvation. He saw the heavy iron kettle resting by the hearth. He smelled the metallic, coppery tang of the blood he had brought into the very center of her sanctuary. I brought this to her, Silas thought, a dark, suffocating guilt rising in his throat like thick, choking wood smoke. She was suffering in the valley, and I brought her into a slaughterhouse. I'm a magnet for violence. I ruin everything I touch. When the wounds were tightly bound with clean strips of white linen torn from her own petticoat, Maeve stepped back, wiping her blood-stained hands on a rag. "It will hold until the bleeding stops entirely," she said softly, offering him a tentative, deeply relieved smile. Silas didn't smile back. His rugged, bearded face was a mask of grey, agonizing resignation. He stood up, ignoring the sharp, tearing pull of his bandaged thigh. He walked to the center of the room, dropping heavily to his knees on the dirt floor. He pried up a massive, loose floorboard near the edge of the root cellar and reached deep into the dark, freezing cavity beneath the earth. He pulled out a heavy, worn leather satchel. He carried it to the table and dropped it. It hit the thick oak with a heavy, incredibly dense thud that rattled the tin plates on the shelves. He untied the thick leather drawstrings. Inside, gleaming dully in the morning light filtering through the shattered back window, were dozens of heavy, pure, stamped silver bars and a heavy sack of minted gold coins. It was a king's ransom, the culmination of a decade of surviving the impassable peaks, hoarding the wealth he had never had a reason to spend until he saw her freezing in the mud. Silas pushed the heavy bag toward Maeve. "Pack your things," Silas rumbled, his voice flat, brittle, and completely devoid of the quiet, rumbling warmth they had shared over the long winter. He refused to look at her soft, beautiful face. He stared blankly at the scarred wood of the table. Maeve froze, the bloody rag slipping entirely from her fingers to the floor. "What?" "The pass will be completely clear by tomorrow," Silas continued, the words tearing at his throat like swallowed glass. "The Rowan draft horse can carry you down the far side of the ridge. You won't have to go anywhere near Cobb's Tavern or the valley. You can ride straight to the railhead in Fort Smith. You take the train east to Chicago or Boston." Maeve's heart hammered a frantic, terrified rhythm against her ribs. She took a step toward the table, her hands gripping the thick wood. "Silas, what are you saying?" "I'm saying you're incredibly wealthy," he growled, his broad shoulders shaking violently with the sheer monumental effort it took to maintain the lie of his indifference. "There's enough silver in that bag to buy a grand mansion, to hire servants to cook for you. You can eat the finest pastries, roast meats every night, and sleep in a bed of pure silk. You can hire guards. You can be safe." "I'm safe here," Maeve pleaded, her voice cracking, hot tears welling in her eyes. "Look around!" Silas roared, the sudden booming volume making her flinch backward. He gestured wildly to the splintered oak door, the blood staining the pristine floorboards, the shattered glass in the back window. "Does this look safe?" "I am a feral man, Maeve. I live a brutal, feral life in the dirt and the blood. I brought you to pull you out of the freezing mud, but I brought you directly into a crossfire. The town is right. Cobb was right to fear me. I am a beast. I can't protect you from the world when I'm the very thing the world comes hunting to destroy." He looked at her then, his pale, slate-grey eyes swimming with a grief so profound, so devastatingly deep, it seemed to hollow out his massive chest entirely. "You are too good for this dark," he whispered, his voice breaking. "You are too soft, too beautiful for a monster's life in the cold. Take the silver. Go live in the light, where you will never see blood again." Maeve stared at the heavy leather satchel. It was the answer to every desperate weeping prayer of her childhood, the absolute key to a life of unimaginable ease, where she would never have to haul freezing ash, scrub cast iron, or suffer the cruel, mocking eyes of men ever again. It was enough wealth to ensure her stomach would never, ever know the agonizing ache of hunger. She looked at the heavy bag. She stepped forward and picked it up. She gripped the thick leather straps with both hands. The satchel was incredibly heavy, pregnant with a terrifying amount of unrefined wealth. Silas closed his eyes, his massive chest caving in on itself. "It is right," he told himself, fighting the agonizing, suffocating burn behind his eyelids. "She deserves to be cherished in a soft, civilized place. She deserves a man who isn't covered in scars and the blood of hired guns. Maeve turned her back to him, but she didn't walk to the massive bed to pack her clothes. She walked past the heavy cast-iron stove, moving to the back of the cabin, toward the window the hired thug had shattered. The cold mountain wind howled through the jagged opening, carrying the deafening eternal roar of the swollen, icy gorge, hundreds of feet below the granite cliff face. She lifted the heavy bag to the wooden sill, her restored healthy arms strained with the immense weight. "Maeve," Silas asked, his thick brow furrowing in deep confusion, taking a halting step toward the center of the room. "What are you doing?" Maeve didn't hesitate. She shoved the heavy bag over the ledge. The thick leather satchel tumbled into the void. There was no grand sound, no dramatic explosion. Just a long, silent drop, followed seconds later by a distant, heavy splash as a fortune in raw silver hit the frothing, icy meltwater of the gorge, swallowed instantly and forever by the mountain. Silas's eyes flew wide open. His jaw dropped, the breath rushing from his massive lungs in a stunned, disbelieving exhale. "Human! Are you mad? That was your freedom. That was a kingdom." Maeve turned back to face him. The bright morning light framed her generous, beautifully full silhouette, the mountain wind whipping her dark hair around her face. She didn't look like a ruined, starving girl from a mud-soaked tavern yard. She looked like an absolute queen standing in the exact center of her own impenetrable fortress. "Freedom from what?" she demanded, stepping away from the window, closing the distance between them with steady, purposeful strides. "From you? From the only man who ever looked at my body and didn't see a burden to be starved, but a life to be worshipped? From the man who slow-roasted my meals and fed me by hand while I was too weak to lift my own head?" She walked right up to him, invading his space, forcing the towering giant to look down into her fierce, tear-filled eyes. "You think a bag of metal makes me safe?" Maeve asked, her voice trembling with an overwhelming, consuming love that dwarfed the fear of any bullet. "I lived in a town full of civilized men, Silas, and they threw me in the mud and offered to sell me for a bottle of cheap rye. I don't want a soft life. I don't want a civilized man." She reached out, grabbing the thick canvas of his open, blood-stained shirt, and yanked downward with every ounce of her restored strength. He stumbled, his knees giving way under the sheer, unexpected force of her conviction. He fell heavily to his knees on the pine floorboards, his massive, scarred face level with her waist. "I was starved in the valley," Maeve whispered fiercely, her soft, warm hands coming up to gently cradle his massive, bearded face. She didn't flinch from the blood or the dirt. She pressed her palms directly against his cheeks, pulling his head forward until his forehead rested against her soft, full stomach. "I found my feast on this mountain. I am staying." Silas broke. The heavy iron walls he had built around his soul for years, the punishing isolation he had sentenced himself to in the frozen peaks, shattered into fine, unrecognizable dust. A ragged, choking sob ripped out of his massive chest, a sound of such profound, agonizing release it physically shook the floorboards beneath them. He wrapped his thick, powerful arms entirely around her waist, burying his face deeper into the soft, warm curve of her stomach, holding onto her with a desperate, holy reverence. "My Maeve," he wept, the hot tears soaking into the fabric of her flannel shirt, washing away the cold and the blood. "My wife. My heart. I am right here," she whispered, her fingers gently stroking his thick, dark, wildly tangled hair, feeling the violent trembling of his broad shoulders slowly begin to ease against her body. "I am not going anywhere, my giant. The harvest belongs to us now." He shifted, pulling back just enough to look up at her. He lifted his massive, rough hands, cupping the soft, full curves of her hips. He leaned forward and pressed his mouth directly against her stomach, a kiss of absolute, unshakable devotion, worshipping the very flesh the world had deemed a sin. He held her there in the ruins of the fight, the cold wind blowing through the shattered glass, the fire popping warmly in the cast-iron stove. The silver was gone, lost to the river, but as Silas Ridge held the woman who had chosen his scarred darkness over the world's light, he knew with absolute, undeniable certainty that he had never been richer. Epilogue, 3 years later. The summer sun in the Blood Pine Ridge was a brilliant, blinding gold, turning the rugged, jagged granite into a warm, vibrant canopy of emerald pine and blooming mountain laurel. The cabin had fundamentally changed. It was no longer a dark, brooding cave built for a solitary beast to hide from his ghosts. The logs had been meticulously rechinked with bright, clean clay. A wide wraparound porch of smooth-sanded cedar had been added, facing the valley below, catching the warm southern drafts. The shattered back window was now a beautiful pane of clear glass that let the morning light flood the swept wooden floors. The heavy scent of isolation was entirely gone, replaced by the constant mouth-watering aroma of baking bread, slow-roasting venison, and wild mountain herbs. On the porch, sitting on the top step, was Silas. He wore a clean canvas shirt, the sleeves rolled up to expose his thick, heavily muscled forearms. He was using a small knife to whittle a wooden spoon out of a block of soft pine. The cold, dead slate of his eyes had been permanently replaced by a warm, watchful, incredibly deep peace. The heavy oak door creaked open. Maeve stepped out onto the porch. She wore a dress of soft, light blue cotton, the collar open and loose. She was radiantly, beautifully full-figured, the soft, generous curves of her hips and breasts completely unhidden, glowing with a profound, unshakable health. She moved with total confidence, her dark hair pinned loosely up, catching the golden sunlight. Resting effortlessly against her chest, supported by her arm, was a plump, giggling infant with a mop of thick, dark hair and bright, slate-grey eyes. Silas stopped carving. He set the knife down and stood up. He moved instantly to her side, wrapping a massive arm securely around her waist, pulling her flush against his side. His large hand came up to gently cup the back of the baby's head, his thumb lightly stroking the soft, dark cheek. "He's hungry again," Maeve smiled, leaning her head against Silas's broad shoulder with a contented sigh as the baby reached out with a surprisingly strong grip to tug at his father's thick beard. Silas chuckled, a deep, rich sound that vibrated in the warm air, echoing off the pines. "He's a ridge. He knows a good feast when he sees one." Silas turned his head, pressing a soft, lingering kiss directly onto Maeve's lips, tasting the wild honey and the crisp mountain air. He didn't just kiss her, he held her entirely, his massive hands resting on the soft curves he had sworn to protect. They stood together on the porch, looking out over the jagged, beautiful wilderness that had once been a prison of grief and starvation. Far below, where the valley opened up, the mud of Cobb's Tavern was a lifetime away, utterly forgotten. Down in the deep gorge, beneath tons of rushing water and silt, a fortune in raw silver lay buried. Up on the ridge, bathed in the light of the afternoon sun, the giant and his queen held everything that mattered, wealthy beyond measure, deeply nourished, and entirely, perfectly free.